Welcome to ZKM Karlsruhe, Germany. I'm having an extensive presentation here, which involves a gallery with a number of different installations. There is also, in the Zubraum, there will be a sound installation with my colleague, Catherine Christer-Hennigs. We will take you through the gallery. We will take you down to the Zubraum. One of the things that I'm known for is concept art. You will see a lot of that in the gallery. We are wearing a piece of mine. Which way is up? In this form, as you see, if I hold it this way, it says 2 minus 1 equals 1. If you happen to see it in this orientation, it says 1 equals 1 minus 2. So that the point is that the same inscription is both true and false, depending on your angle of view. Here we are at the entrance to the gallery. It happens that they used the photograph of me giving my 1963 lecture at Walter de Maria's loft, which was a comprehensive critique of culture that ended with two proposals. One of them is what is now called Brand, or what I later called Brand, which you may read about somewhere. The other was questions of free time, boredom, and liked work in a utopian society. At that moment in time, I took Marxism-Leninism seriously, and that was what I had in mind at that point. I would thoroughly reconstitute the conception at this point, but at the same time, I'm more committed than ever to the notion that there has to be a civilization beyond this one. Around here you have some vitrines with various documents and publications. But now we're going to go inside the gallery. First we will do a kind of a walkthrough so that you can see how it is arranged linearly, so to speak. And then after that I will comment on individual pieces more sort of in the time order in which they came into play. Okay, so if we go chronologically, then we start in this section. These are largely loans from the Museum of Modern Art in New York. They go back to 1959. Some documents here are in facsimile. We have a drawing that I did in Professor Quine's mathematical logic class at Harvard, the ugly drawing. We have a page of a violin score that came in facsimile from Tony Conrad's archive, and I made a fair copy of that very recently, which is on exhibit here. This is sort of when I was in my post-Cage period, if I may say so. The first composition that I had on a concert was December 1959. And then you move from that into my performance at Yoko Ono's loft in the series curated by Lamont Young in February of 1961. And continuing to speak about 1959, which saw my first performed composition at Harvard, which saw the ugly drawing. which was very close to the time that I did the violin score that you have a page from over here. I also did, on a piece of stationery with different pencils, I did a gray image, an image made out of grays, and that came back decades later as acrylic on linen, I mean as a large painting. But it's exactly the same image with exactly the same proportions. While I'm here in Karlsruhe, I had an opportunity to recreate two of the piano performances that I did in Yoko Ono's loft. And in addition to that, around the same time frame, I made a recording of a violin performance, which was done for the tape. In other words, it's a piece whose final form is only in tape. It is actually meant to be played much louder than an acoustic violin would be. But I had the opportunity to recreate these three pieces here just the other day. We call these head arrangements when you create a definite composition but you don't write it down, you just keep it in memory, so to speak. And one of the reasons for doing that, for not writing it down, is because you want a kind of improvisational flexibility that you could not get if you tried to write it out note for note. But at the same time, I mean, even though you have that flexibility, it most definitely is one composition, and if you record it several times, it will be very clear that you're playing this one and the same piece over and over again. So we now have the opportunity to let you both see and hear those recreations, because we have a video of those performances in the recording studio. And so I'm going to throw you over to those three performances, and then we will come back to the gallery. I might say that the violin piece was played on the Harvard radio station as publicity for the concert that I organized at Harvard, March 31, 1961, where Richard Maxfield, Lamont Young, and Robert Morris traveled to Cambridge to participate. After that point in time, I guess that I became much more aggressive. I mean, people would already have considered me to be aggressively original, I suppose, but at any rate, I became much more aggressive in terms of my own posture relative to this self-described avant-garde. And so it was later, you know, within a few months, I announced concept art. I gave the critique of the sort of the idea of newness that Lamont Young had identified himself with, the mystique of newness. I gave the lecture in his apartment, actually, to sort of the assembled avant-garde. My objections to that idea of newness. This was the point at which I wrote exercise awareness states, the early concept art pieces that went right on into the fall of 1961, and even continued into 1962. There are other pieces, the so-called energy cube organism, the so-called perception dissociator. The reason for mentioning that is because in the loan from the Museum of Modern Art, we have sort of a version of what I now call the optical audio player. It was never built. It was just an idea, but I have sort of this extensive theory for it here. Also, as further explanation, I have sketches from 2012 because still right over there, as a matter of fact, because it's still very much in play. Another piece, which was originally concept art, and then I sort of co-opted it for the optical audio player. I don't think today that that was such a good idea, but at any rate, that piece came back, and it has now been installed. I mean, this is the second time that this piece has had an installation. The first was at the Kunstverein in Düsseldorf. As it turns out, as concept art developed and as we had the opportunity to think about it over the decades, it basically springs from mathematics, or to be more precise, from metamathematics. As far as it is also an aesthetic activity, it is very much about seeing. And in many cases, I mean, you will realize that I'm asking you to see in a certain way, or to see something unusual. That is very much the point. Here, you're asked to stand on the other side and look out towards the, towards the open area. You're asked to focus your eyes on the plane of the paper. I mean, what is on the other side of the hole passes without your focusing on it. There are instructions on the pedestal, and we also have copies of this sheet that the visitors can take. So you can try it yourself at home. So I had done the two piano performances in Yoko Ono's loft, and possibly at very close to that time, or before, I did what I would have called a cartoon. also on stationery with a ballpoint pen and colored pencil. And I destroyed that along with everything else. When I returned to the art world or entered the art world in the late 80s, I decided that I wanted to get that back as well. And so I began to do these cartoons which were intended to be in the manner of that 1961 cartoon. And I developed it actually, as you can see, into a series of 5. The one that is probably the most similar to what I did in 1961 is the first here. And then as I continued, you will see that I varied it, finally ending up with a pink and black piece over here, and then even beyond that. Yes, I guess that we have to describe that as a large blue head. There's a use of silver pencil in this one, which is nothing like that in the previous ones. So, although this is a later series, it very much came from the idea of trying to recreate one of the 1961 pieces. Yeah, it seems that we're very busy with 1961. I guess I had a lot of ideas then, which I wanted to return to in the late 80s. I decided to do a painting in the manner of John Cage. That's how I was thinking. And many years later, I learned that other people had tried the same sort of thing. I'm glad that I didn't know about it, because I like my interpretation of Cage's method. And as I learned about the others, I don't like theirs at all. But at any rate, I conceived of painting as a performance. You are going to apply chance procedures in the selection of brushes, pigments, and so forth and so on. You would perform an action with your eyes closed. You would never see the canvas while you were painting. The painting itself would be a residue of the performance. So the first painting that I did like this, I didn't have to destroy it because it destroyed itself. It sat on a surface. I must say that a part of this is you use raw oil paint, you use turpentine, and you use refined linseed oil. And you just freely dump them on the canvas. I mean, if that is what the throw of the dice or the coins, if that's what it tells you to do, that's what you do. You end up with a very wet canvas with small mounds of paint on it. It can only be stored flat, because if you tip it, then you're repainting it. It has to be kept flat at all times. But at any rate, the first one was simply destroyed by dust. So I had to throw it away. When I decided to do this again in the late 80s, I very carefully, it was originally done on canvas board, which is something cheap that you buy in an art supply store. The second time around, I had my canvas board custom made by my assistant, and it has a plexiglass shadow box that goes over it whenever it's not being exhibited. The box only comes off when it goes into the vitrine. So far there are 3 in this series. The first, we need to get a color photograph of it up on the internet, but I mean there is the first, there is the second. This was originally going to be the second, but as it turned out, it turned out to be the third. This is the one where the ground is white. I'm using a palette with only two colors, blue and green. As it turned out, the linseed oil added a third tint of yellow, which transitions between the blue and the green in a way that I think proved to be very fortunate for the look of this painting. But these pieces, you know, I wish that I actually had all of them together to show to you at the same time. You would understand better what I'm about to say. But somebody, you know, who may be coming to this with no familiarity whatsoever, it may just look like a mess. But if you understand it better, that is not what is happening. I mean, especially the second one in the series. If I may say so, it's a gorgeous painting, but it has a configuration that nobody would arrive at by just sort of standing there and painting here and painting there in what would seem like some kind of logical way. In other words, the chance procedures add a layer of, there's a kind of distance or a kind of strangeness which I don't think you could put in by sort of consciously trying to paint in an eccentric way or something. So I mean, that's the value of it. That's why I use it. I also extensively use those methods in my published albums of music. As we move towards 1962, my critique of sort of the art enterprise as it was known to the avant-garde becomes more and more aggressive. And so finally I announced my sort of this, what I would call today the Brand theory, the anti-art position. I write an essay on it. By the end of 1962, that essay is published here in Germany, in Fastel's Décollage. And, you know, it continues to move forward. By 1963, I'm giving this lecture from which we have the photograph at the entrance to the gallery. By that point, moving in the direction of Marxism-Leninism, in the direction of becoming a cadre. It was George Maciunas who, for me, was the one who raised the social question in the avant-garde. I mean, the avant-garde basically ignored the social question, which is I mean, this is obviously, it's a screaming omission. How can you talk about being absolutely new and changing everything and being absolutely blind to the society around you? I mean, to me, that was preposterous. I mean, obviously, transformation, you know, does not end with society. I mean, it ought to begin with society. I mean, how could you seriously talk about a new culture if, you know, the foundations, the social foundations, not only remain the same, but if you're actually against them? I mean, if you're living in a society whose foundations you're actually against, then to talk about a new culture can at most only be a utopian gesture of some sort, an indication, a promise, you know, which people will not live it at all. You know, so I mean, this is kind of the way that I was thinking. This is why I went in that direction, why you finally get the pamphlet that I did with Maciunas, Communists Must Give Revolutionary Leadership in Culture, which is in the vitrine over there. The full pamphlet may very well have been the first publication of Maciunas's architectural initiatives. I look back on that today. Maciunas is long deceased. I look back on that today, and I have to say that many of the judgments that we made about what the Soviet Union was, about what we were doing. I mean, I was getting my ideas about culture at that point basically from Maciunas. I look back now and I see that certain of his slogans were not really appropriate. We didn't really understand what we were doing. His architectural proposal doesn't wear so well today. Nevertheless, it seems to have been a phase that we had to go through. And I would say it's not so much that it was wrong as that it simply has to be sort of rethought and reconstituted. There is then a fairly long period in which I'm not especially active as an artist. I meet or I begin to work with Catherine Krister-Henniks. I began to work with her very actively, and at some point around 1987 we decided that we needed to revive concept art in particular. At first it was only going to be concept art, and so that is how I came to do works for exhibition and sort of to return to the art world, or I mean in a very real sense. 1987, 88, 89 was my first time in the art world. I returned to, I reactivate concept art in 1987, and the problem became how to make exhibited art with these ideas. And one of the plans that I had was to do a series of signs. So here we have stroke numeral, which was one of the earliest pieces that I did in that period. I'm not going to give you the theory of it. You can read about that on my website if you wish. There is an entire essay called The Apprehension of Plurality, which discusses this in great detail. We have self-validating falsehood. This sentence is in French. I discovered unexpectedly that Wittgenstein had thought of this same thing in one of his, it turns up in one of his posthumous works, but I certainly came to it independently of that. But it is the question of doubt about which language one is speaking, the possibility of questioning which language one is speaking, and that, the visitors to an art exhibit do not necessarily understand. They may see some other kind of joke here, or they may see a joke or something like that and not realize that the point of this is that it is a kind of extreme skepticism, but that is the actual point here. Every other sentence on this wall is false. I chose to make that as wallpaper. It allows you to have, like I suppose by now, hundreds of sentences, each calling all of the others false. I chose the colors so that this would work as kitchen wallpaper, as a matter of fact. It was once installed for that purpose, actually, when the Emily Harvey Gallery had a residence in the back with a kitchen. So that is the reason for the choice of colors. But this is a study of of a much larger question of sentences which refer to each other and sort of the logical problems that you get into when sentences refer to each other. I mean, including the liar paradoxes as one, but certainly not the only example. When I was active in the early 90s, because of concept art and because of the way that people misunderstood or confused concept art and conceptual art, I thought that I should try to provoke the conceptual artists. I published this advertisement challenge to conceptual artists. The conceptual artists paid no attention to it whatsoever. That may be understandable because considering what the advertisement asked for, I expect that the reason why they did not respond to it is because they couldn't. I mean, because they would not have been able to contribute anything to the point. But we did get a few responses. I had some, it's sort of a problem that you're asked to solve. I had 3 solutions of my own that I wanted to contribute. We got 4 answers from other people that I considered interesting enough, so we made the set of 7 plaques. You have to work with seven small sticks or less, 7 or less small sticks. The one on the lower left here is from Catherine Christer-Hennick's, the same colleague that I'm in the sound environment with. This began as a piece called Tritone Monochord, whose purpose was to discuss, well, it's the question of whether you can play the musical interval, the tritone, which is irrational, whether you can tune it. And Lamont Young is famously associated with the position that you cannot tune irrational intervals because the waveform takes forever to cycle out. Whether you think that that's a good reason or not, I mean, he has defended that position for a long time. My original point here was that you can guarantee the tuning of the tritone by using geometry, because if the upper pitch is the side of a square, then the lower pitch is the diagonal of the square. That's a tritone. So originally I set this up, that would be the upper figure, the upper bridge and the upper string. That's what tritone monochord is. There was a whole theoretical development around that. Glenn Branca was involved with all of that. And sort of there the matter rested until the Kunstverein show last year. And I decided, well, you know, why don't we take this whole situation one step further? And so this work was actually made in Dusseldorf. I mean, I designed it in New York and it was actually executed in Dusseldorf. And so you see that you have 2, they're called monochords. You have 2 monochords. They are tuned, the longer strings are tuned in the interval of a fifth, so we could call them C and G, for those who are familiar with musical terminology. That would be this. That it's not, as a matter of fact, it's not perfect, but it's actually pretty good. I mean, in other words, so we decided not to try to improve on it. That would be a rather dicey proposition unless we had a great deal of time. But at any rate, this is the tritone. if it sounds like a sour interval, that's because it is. I mean, it is the most sour interval there is. It was called the devil's interval in the Middle Ages. This on the upper strings. What having both of them at the same time allows you to do is to make the point that, okay, here you have a legitimate tritone. Then you have a minor second of a peculiar sort. And then this is going to be a tritone at a fifth. So you're going to have this situation. I mean, that's a minor ninth, or if you subtract the octave displacement, it's another minor second. We have a minor second here, and we have another one here. And you know, I haven't, I've sort of worked out the theory of it, but I'm not exactly remembering that now, and there's still some more work to be done on the theory of it, but it's very possible that these two minor seconds are not tuned in the same way. Let me try to give you in capsule form the larger lesson as far as music theory is concerned that you get from this piece, and then I'll talk about its qualities as an artwork, which is a separate issue. Musical scales are like pronunciation in languages. They're very much matters of public taste. They're established by public taste. I mean, the lisp in Castilian Spanish, the reason why it's correct is because everybody does it. That's what makes it correct. Very important point. And musical scales are the same way. In other words, and this is really about the European scale. And for example, you can use the overtone series to define intervals. And there are perfectly good intervals in the overtone series which are not used in Europe because Europeans don't like them. I mean, even though they're perfectly reasonable, I mean, it may be like, for example, the minor third, for example. There might be a perfectly reasonable minor third or a minor sixth in the overtone series which are not in the European scale because the European public has never accepted them. What this is sort of introducing you to is the fact that here you have, for example, what would be called a rational interval. I'm not going to go heavily into musical theory here, but you have like this rational interval of the fifth, which is in the overtone series. We could equally well have used these strings, which are higher and maybe a little easier to hear. Yeah, that's a good representation of the fifth. So you have that, that's a rational interval, whereas this is an irrational interval. And Europeans insist in their music on having a scale which goes back, as it goes up the scale, it goes back and forth between these rational and irrational intervals. That's one of the things that you learn from this. I mean, it is very, very strange. you know, sort of, shall we say, intellectually indefensible. I mean, music theorists have been, you know, tearing their hair over this, I guess, or Hindemith in particular, who happens to have been Germany's most prominent composer in the first half of the 20th century. But I mean, that, you know, that's just a coincidence. But I mean, he wrote a book which began to explore some of these questions. As an artwork, it occurred to me to make the lower figure heavier. You see the line is heavier and so forth than the upper figure. The point of, and also to do it on acrylic glass. The result of that is that when the viewer stands at a considerable distance from it, you see something three-dimensional, as if you're looking into a fish tank. And then as you walk toward it, the faces come together until you finally realize that it's a plane. I call that flatness shock. So, but I mean, that is the, shall we say, my artistic contribution to this piece. We're now inside of logically impossible space. It has a bit of a story, as many of my pieces do. I got the idea for it because of the 1982 Backworks show. I wanted to illustrate for people what a Necker cube is. We had an assistant draw a Necker cube, and it was propped against the wall when I walked into the gallery, and I saw it for the first time. I mean, you're seeing it now. And the Necker cube famously, you know, it goes one way and then the other in terms of perspective. But for me, this one went both ways at the same time. And I found that absolutely amazing. Not everybody sees that. You know, I don't really care about that. I'm just satisfied that I see it. But maybe someday somebody will try to answer the question why somebody see it that way and others don't. But I decided that I wanted to make a piece where you can, so to speak, be immersed in this image. You can lie on the floor and it's everywhere you look, including the ceiling. So, I mean, that is basically the point of this, to allow you to come in here and become immersed in this image. And here in Karlsruhe, I added a tone, which you can probably hear. Having something, you know, seemed to work better than dead silence. I mean, you know, I guess I'm still thinking about that, about why, but that's how we've set it up here. I may say also that we have another installation in the Procure, which involves an entire room. We have an entire small cinema, and 5 of my films are being shown. It takes about a half an hour to screen all 5 of them, and they begin over again each hour. The films are an entire experience unto itself, which you may investigate. We're not going to try to delineate them in the tour. This work takes us back to 1961, but it was also new as of 2 decades ago. Without going into a long explanation of it, it had a graphic made up of colored squares with what amounted to black bar lines. It was originally done with colored pencil on stationery. When I sort of began showing with the gallery, I made that same image in as a painting, acrylic on linen. So that is called Poem 4, another large painting. And then in the course of the first exhibition, I happened to see it the way that it was broken up by a double mirror, and that gave me the idea of realizing that, that fragmented image as a painting in its own right, and that's what this is, a mirror fragmented poem. This piece, as a matter of fact, came out of that series of cartoons, if you wish to call them that, the Spirit World paintings. There are others that I haven't shown, and on one of them this appeared as the roof of a building. And in the end, I decided to make a model of this. It was conceived as an architectural element, as a design for a roof. But I made a model. Then the model became a maquette, and that's how we show it now. We show it as if it were a sculpture called Needle Sandwich because of these red, these red spikes that come to a point. Beginning in the late 80s, I branched out from concept art to modern art, or I returned to modern art, and this work is one that came from that pursuit. It actually has a history which I'm not going to go into here, but the Peruvian piece is basically, I saw a piece of Peruvian jewelry in a museum that had a certain color scheme which I liked. As a matter of fact, I mean, the correct scheme is violet, aquamarine, vermilion, and then dark blue and black. It finally became, there are pieces before this one. This was the last to be designed, and we just realized it in Dusseldorf last year. The painting is done with automobile paint by an automobile painter, and this is gold leaf applied by a goldsmith. So it's a geometric abstraction, but with a non-rectangular frame, and without going into it too much. I mean, the way that these hexagons sort of, the way that they both are symmetrical and are not symmetrical, sort of, the width of the stripes and so forth and so on is very, very important, sort of for the overall, the crystallization of the overall effect. This is a series of images. Actually, they're digital files which are realized in Lambda on Kodak Endura. They originally came out of my films as stills, but I wanted to make them into a series of images like this, and I call them Future of the Image because my intention here is to make a very aggressive statement actually about what I think the visual image should become for artists, not representational, not geometric abstraction, not screensavers, which are basically the product of mathematical formulas, but something else, something which is elusive, which has references, but as I say, is not representational. Sometimes it's biomorphic. It has an immense amount of detail, but it's not mathematically generated like a fractal, thank goodness. Sometimes it can begin to become biomorphic. I mean, in this particular case, you have a combination where some of it is mechanical, some of it is biomorphic, and I've given all of them titles over here so that it sort of further gives you an idea. For example, this is Inky Portal. This is Scarab Rax Fusion. This is Birth of the Antichrist. Then we go on to Turquoise Steak, and so forth and so forth and so forth. I mean, you have the titles here. You will be able to follow them as you wish. We move now from the gallery to the Subraum, where we have a sound installation, I and my colleague Catherine Krister-Hannix. And our name for this is Illuminatory Sound Environments. It's not any sound installation, it's of a very special character. This genre actually originated with a performance by Hannix at the Moderna Musik in Stockholm in 1976. And sort of growing out of that, I wished to work in a similar way, and so.
That's it?
That's it.
All right.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.